Good morning. Now that the UPSC has announced the results for the Civil Services main examination, all of you would be busy getting ready for the interviews. The first and extremely important step here is filling up the detailed application form. This is, of course, the second version of the DAF. The first one you had filled up after the PT, before the main exam. Now, before the interview, you're going to be filling up the second version of this DAF. This is extremely important. I would like you first to understand why I consider, or for that matter, everybody considers this to be extremely important. The detailed application form contains a lot of information which will constitute the subject matter for a significant part of the interview when you go to the UPSC. This is the place that you will be visiting. For some people, it would be the first visit. Others might have been there earlier, appearing in some interviews, etc. Now, when you go there, the interview board will have your DAF information before them. The DAF information is the starting point for the interviews. For many people, it constitutes a critical part of the assessment. You have to fill this up very carefully. Now, why is the interview so important? Let's also have a look at this issue. See, in some ways, the interview appears to have very limited weightage as compared to the written examination. Just 275 marks, where the written exams carries 1750. You've already appeared in the written exam. You've done very well. That's why you've managed to come through to this stage. But as you will be aware, the range of marks in the written examination is not very wide. The interview marks prove to be critical in several ways. First, the interview marks may determine your selection for the civil service. Look at the cutoff points for the last exam. The interview cutoff was 745. The final selection cutoff was at 951. A person, a candidate, who had just managed to qualify with 745 marks, the cutoff. This is, of course, for general candidates. For different categories, these numbers would vary slightly. So a candidate who just managed to qualify with 745 could also have reached selection level, the final selection level, by scoring 206 marks in the interview. 206 out of 275 is not very easy, but at the same time, it is definitely achievable. A lot of people do score marks of 210 and above. Lot meaning, well, absolute numbers, not in percentage terms. So the interview definitely matters. In some ways, I would imagine that I'm preaching to the converted. All of you are well aware of this. You're going to be spending the next few weeks preparing for the interviews in various ways, appearing in mock interviews, and so on. But the first step, let's note, is filling up the DAF. And this is an immediate step. The UPSC has a deadline for this. You don't fill up the DAF. You don't go for the interview, even though you have qualified. So obviously, you're going to be filling up this DAF. The DAF will be important in several ways. Let me show you something on this. The DAF contains or requires a lot of routine information from candidates. Routine information pertains to your background, family background, etc. All that is obviously candidate specific. You know best about that. And obviously you'll be filling it up accurately. But there are two aspects of the DAF which become very important. That is what we are providing you some guidance for today. One of these aspects is important in the short term. The interview that you'll be facing between January and February. When you go up before the interview board, they invariably use your DAF as a starting point for grilling you, or let's say for questioning you. You should not consider this as a grilling exercise. So what you write here is important in terms of what you're going to be asked. And there are candidates who manage to move the interview on a particular track and do very well thanks to their DAF. So that is the short-term importance of this form. I hope it's clear to you. Short-term importance meaning what you're going to encounter in the interview, how you're going to perform in the interview will be significantly determined by the information that you fill up in this DAF. Of course, the DAF is not the only thing. There are many other aspects about which you will be asked questions in the interview. Obviously, you'll be preparing for all of those also. But today's focus is on the DAF. This routine information does not require any guidance. I don't think we need tell you how to write your name or your address or your parents' names, etc. But there's one aspect of this routine information also which I would like to draw your attention to. You see, one of the things that will be determined in this DAF will be what is your home state, or in some cases it might be your home union territory. Why is this important? it is important if you are selected for one of the All India services. That means the Indian Administrative Service and the Indian Police Service. And we'll see this in a short while because that's also part of the DAF. The home state or the union territory to which you belong to is not predetermined. Now, what do we mean by this? The factors which are taken into account in deciding on your home state would include these: mother tongue, your place of birth, the state and district to which your father belongs, the state and district to which your mother belongs, and the places where you have been educated. This could include school education, college education, graduate, postgraduate, etc. Now, a few decades ago, in what I would say, the old India meaning before economic liberalization and dramatic technological and social changes upended things. This would have been very simple. Most people would have been born in a state whose mother tongue they shared. You could have been born, for example, in Tamil Nadu. Your mother tongue was Tamil. Your father was also an inhabitant of Tamil Nadu, born in Tamil Nadu. Home state for him was also Tamil Nadu. Your mother's home state was Tamil Nadu. And much of your education would have taken place in Tamil Nadu. And given all this, Tamil Nadu would obviously be your home state. I think it should be clear. You obviously would not claim that your home state is Uttar Pradesh with Tamil as your mother tongue, Tamil Nadu as your place of birth, your parent state, and your place of education. 2022, that's now India today, things are often very different. Now, for many of you, many of those who are filling up the DAF, even today's situation might be of the same type as I've referred to as old India. But on the other hand, more and more people are now the products of new India. This is what we come across when we look at the DAFs for candidates these days. Mother tongue and place of birth may be quite different. There are people who are born in Delhi, Tamil as their mother tongue. Parents often come from different states. The father may be from, say, Bihar, a mother from Uttar Pradesh. I'm taking adjacent states here. But they could be very distant states also. Education is often outside your home state. Many of those who have qualified for the interviews, for example, come from IITs. There are a large number of IITs now. And very few people may have actually joined an IIT located in their own state. A place of education would also vary. And given all this, now you should understand the issue. UPSC asks you in the DAF to consider these 5 things: your mother tongue, your place of birth, your father's home state, your mother's home state, and the places at which you have been educated in claiming your home state. And if these vary significantly, let's take a typical example. A student whose DAF I looked at some time ago, not this year, earlier years. Her father was from Bihar, mother was from Uttar Pradesh. She was born in Delhi. She was educated in Delhi, Mumbai, and London. So what was her home state? This is where things get dicey. I think there is a lot of flexibility nowadays in this respect. Now, what is the importance of this? The importance is a home state is extremely significant when it comes to allocation of cadres for the All India services. If you say, on the basis of these various information that you have mentioned in the DAF, if you claim your home state as Delhi, a home union territory as Delhi, then your home cadre becomes the Agamut cadre. We'll see this also in a moment. On the other hand, if you say your home state is Bihar or UP or any other state, then that becomes your home cadre. And that makes a significant difference in allocation terms. So this is one thing which people often don't pay adequate attention to. And my advice is that you should be very careful in this. You can use this information to claim a state as your home state, which you might prefer in terms of cadre allocation. But of course, you can't stretch things too far. If your parents are from, say, Tamil Nadu, you were born in Tamil Nadu, your mother tongue is Tamil, but you were educated in, say, IIT Delhi, I don't think that would be the basis for claiming that Delhi is your home union territory. But if some of these points diverge from one another, then you get considerable flexibility in claiming your home state. Please make sure that you do this carefully, taking into account your cadre choices. Now, this is something that we would have to look at in individual terms. We can't give a general advice on this. But this is something to which I think many candidates do not pay adequate attention. And often they regret it later. Once the cadre has been allocated, or even beyond, one of the interesting things in the civil services nowadays is that a lot of those who are selected choose their marriage partner at the academy, a training academy. Once they decide to get married, then cadre changes will come into the picture if they are in All India services. And then it becomes very important. What had you filled up at that stage? Obviously, I'm not saying that you can predict who you're going to marry or who you're going to choose to marry when you reach the academy. You're far from that stage at this time. You're just going to appear in the interview. The final results are several months away. But nevertheless, think a bit about this and take care of this point also while filling up the DAF. Now let's move on to those aspects of the DAF which are focused on much more. Now keep in mind that what you're going to appear in UPSC is an interview which is structured as a personality test. So essentially, the interview board is trying to assess your personality. There are many aspects of your personality that are significant. When you appear in mock interviews, you get a lot of advice regarding these aspects of personality, what you can do with them, how you can present yourself in a more positive way, and so on. As far as the DAF is concerned, what is important is the section on your achievements, your interests, your extracurricular activities, your hobbies, and so on. This is supposed to give some indication about your personality. What are the different aspects that are included in this? One is the prizes, medals, and scholarships that you may have won. I notice the UPSC mentions that this should be at the university, the state, or the national level. So in general, school level achievements are not being considered significant here. The focus is on these prizes, medals, and scholarships that you won at the university level, maybe at the state level, or, well, if you're lucky, maybe at the national level. If you have some significant achievements of this type, do mention them, right? But they should be genuine. You should be having documentary evidence for this, if necessary. This is an indicator of your achievements. This obviously includes academic performance. You could say co-curricular, what is called co-curricular, part of your curriculum. So if you have been the topper and you received a gold medal, obviously that would be very significant. You may have participated in state level debates or national level moot courts. I mean, depending on your background. If you are a law student, you may have been participating in moot courts, etc. You may have received prizes. And in fact, I would go even further now. You see, the UPSC only mentions university, state, and national. But there must be a few candidates nowadays who even have international level achievements. That's even better. Suppose you have represented India in some global contest. We are not talking about sports at this stage. So it's more academic and co-curricular type of activities. So that could also be something very significant for you. If you have any achievements of this type, definitely mention them. That would help you to create a much better impression before the interview board. And they will definitely ask you a few questions about it. So you should be prepared to explain. Let's say you won a debate, you were part of a winning team in some state or national level debate. So what was the subject matter of the debate? How did you argue? These are the types of questions that could be raised. And sometimes the interview board would even ask you, give you an impromptu debating topic and ask you to give a few points for or against that topic in a minute or two, to see how good you really are at debating, how good you really are at thinking on your feet. That's the significance of these prizes, medals, scholarships. It also shows your academic achievements and performance. Now, going beyond prizes and scholarships, sports and NCC. If you have participated in these, from school to college to university level, do mention these. But generally mention it if you have some achievement worth mentioning. If you are representing your, let's say, university team, participated in some tournament. You may not have won the tournament, but yet the fact that you were representing the university or the college in the tournament would be of some significance. Your participation in NCC activities would also have some significance, and these indicate that you have not been confined to purely curricular and academic activities. You have wider interests. They would indicate that you have a well-rounded personality. More important aspects come after this. Now look at some of these things. Positions of distinction, leadership held in school and college. So this includes school level achievements also. It's not only what you did in college that is important here, but also positions that you may have held at school level. School captain, a prefect in the school. These indicate your leadership capabilities. As a civil servant, you're going to be a leader. Any civil service that you join, you will have a leadership position. there'll be a lot of staff under you, working under you. You'll be leading them. We are not talking about, of course, political leadership here. We're talking about the leadership exercised by civil servants, IS officers leading their team, police officers leading the team of police constables and the junior police officers. And similarly, a wide range of other services. So these positions that you've held are also considered of some significance. The point, of course, is that, I can't advise you to write imaginary things here. These should be genuine. And if necessary, things that you can support with some evidence. You must have got certificates, you must have got other types of documentation regarding these positions, etc., that you held. So do mention them, and mention them accurately, carefully. This might also constitute subject matter or part of the interview. What is perhaps most important here is this last aspect. And look at this: other extracurricular activities and interests such as hobbies, etc. Now, extracurricular activities and interests and hobbies all differ slightly. A basic idea is these should not be co-curricular. What is co-curricular? Co-curricular is part of your regular academic curriculum. If you're studying in an IIT, for example, I'm taking examples of IITs because a lot of those who come to appear for these interviews nowadays have an IIT background. I'm not saying that others will not be there. There are people from a lot of other universities, institutions, medical colleges, and so on. But single most important source of interview candidates nowadays for the civil services are the IITs. IITs taken as a whole, not any particular individual IIT, but IITs as a whole. So that's why I'm choosing the IIT as my example here. Co-curricular activities are part of your coursework. You must have studied a lot of courses, taken up projects as part of the coursework. That's not extracurricular. Extracurricular goes beyond the curriculum. So if you took up some projects outside the scope of your academic work, that becomes extracurricular. Hobbies, well, we'll take up some examples of hobbies in a moment, but in general, let's keep in mind that hobbies are activities that you take up out of your interest, your passion, you're interested in certain activities, you're passionate about them, you spend your free time outside your academic work in these hobbies. Now, what is important here is the points that we have made. Whatever you are mentioning, these extracurricular activities and hobbies, we'll talk a bit more about this. But let me emphasize that they should be genuine. It should not be something which is merely aspirational. What's aspirational? You knew that in the civil services, there is a section that you have to fill up in the DAF regarding your hobbies and interests and activities. So you asked people and gave you some advice. And you thought that you would take up something as a hobby for the purpose of mentioning it in the form and then creating a good impression in the course of the interview. But you didn't actually do anything, or very little. Maybe you thought about gardening. We've seen examples of people who have mentioned gardening as a hobby. Now keep in mind that those who will be interviewing you in the UPSC are generally retired persons, retired civil servants. Members of the UPSC are also, in one sense, retired from their regular activities or from other areas of life. They have decades of experience behind them. Their experience in different areas would be much more than your age. And suppose you mention gardening as a hobby. There's a good chance that one or more members in the interview board may be keen gardeners. So we've had examples like this. Somebody mentioned gardening as a hobby. The interview board asked a couple of questions and they felt very doubtful about that person. So a member actually invited the candidate that why don't you come outside with me and have a look at the UPSC garden. I can ask you some questions about that. Now, this is rare. This is not something that's going to happen very often. But it has been known to happen. So keep this in mind. Remember that these hobbies, interests, etc. should be genuine. They should not merely express an aspiration. This is something that I wanted to do, but I actually did not get the time. I did not get around to doing it. Fortunately, you're filling up this DAF just before the interview. So at this stage, obviously, I don't think you're going to be aspirational. My interviews are going to begin next month. So you don't have time now to develop new hobbies and interests. So whatever you will be mentioning will be presumably genuine. There's another point that I would like you to note. It's connected with what I've already explained. That you should be able to stand up to critical scrutiny from the interview board. Whatever these hobbies and interests are, they would ask you questions about them. And if they have a feeling that this candidate is trying to bluff us, they can become critical and you get into difficulties. So you should be prepared to stand up to the grilling. And for that, let me put it this way, you need a lot of practical knowledge about these things. If you've actually been involved in some activity, say gardening, or for that matter, many other activities that we'll mention as examples in a short while, you would have acquired some practical knowledge about these areas. That practical knowledge is what impresses the board. You don't have practical knowledge. If the knowledge is theoretical in this sense that you go and attend some classes by some experts or so-called experts on these hobbies. So there is an expert who comes along and tells you that cooking as a hobby, these are the types of things that you should know. That's very theoretical knowledge, and normally that would be counterproductive in the interview. The practical knowledge of cooking will come by doing actual cooking in the kitchen. How do you use the ingredients? How do you use the cooking devices, instruments in the kitchen, and so on? That comes out of experience, practice, practical knowledge. Now, when it comes to hobbies and interests, I'll give you some examples. People typically write. Reading, traveling, writing, blogging, photography, stamp collecting, philately, and so on. There are many others. Search the internet, you will find lots of advice. And suppose, let's go back again to the same point. Suppose you genuinely have one of these hobbies. Let's take an example to understand this. Now, obviously, we can't take examples from every field. So let me take one example, which is very common. People often write reading. In what sense is reading a hobby? If you have studied at school and college, which obviously you have done before appearing in the civil services examination, reading was part of your curricular activities. You were expected to read books, maybe technical books. You are studying in an IIT, you would have been reading books on science, engineering, mathematics, and so on. So if you are claiming that reading is a hobby of yours, it should go beyond the curriculum. Reading mathematics textbooks is hardly a hobby if you have an engineering background. But on the other hand, if you have a background in, think of something, Hindi literature or English literature, and you read books on advanced mathematics and particle physics, maybe you could claim that as a hobby. But I would imagine that would be a very, very unlikely type of situation. A person who is in the university doing a course in Hindi or English literature, or for that matter, Gujarati literature or Tamil literature, reading books on field theory and particle physics is very unlikely. So the point is, this reading as a hobby should be put, if you want to put it down in your form, put it more precisely, more narrowly. Reading going beyond your curriculum. Number one, be clear on this, that this reading should be something which was not part of your curriculum. Your typical studies at college level, particularly at college level. Then reading, well, let's say you like to read fiction. So people sometimes write reading fiction. Now, fiction in what language? English fiction, Hindi fiction, Tamil fiction, fiction translated from French and German, or maybe Chinese. And think a bit more. Do you like classical fiction? Suppose you write that I read English fiction. Do you like to read classical fiction? Are you a person, for example, who loves, say, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Thackeray, some of the leading 19th century novelists? Or are you focused on the 20th century? Or, you could be, your hobby might be reading Indian authors in English. There are a lot of Indian authors who have written acclaimed novels and books in the last few decades. Starting from R.K. Narayan down to recent authors. So maybe that's your area of interest. So be careful in filling this up. Narrow it down. If you like reading Indian authors in English, Indian novelists, Indian fiction, explain that. You like reading Hindi fiction or Bengali fiction, specify that. If you like non-fiction, well, non-fiction is also a very broad area. What sort of non-fiction do you like? Try to specify that also. Suppose you claim cooking as a hobby. Obviously, you will not be trying to cook every possible dish in the world. So focus there also. Cooking Chinese dishes. Maybe cooking French dishes. Or if you want to make it much more local, maybe you like cooking typical Bihari dishes. If you happen to be from Bihar, you might be trying out litti, chokha, etc. So when you're writing about these hobbies and interests, the advice is to be focused, to narrow it down, and make sure that these are not activities or hobbies which are essentially a restatement of your academic curriculum. We come across people who have written reading newspapers as a hobby. Think a bit about it. The newspaper industry worldwide, or at least in developed countries, is declining. USA, Europe, etc., the readership for newspapers is decreasing. In India, it is still increasing. Of course, a lot of people nowadays must be reading newspapers on electronic media, mobile phones, tablets, and so on, rather than the paper version. Nevertheless, they are reading newspapers. And reading newspapers is part of our everyday life. How can you claim that as a hobby? Well, you can, but then you must be clear. If it's a hobby, that would imply that it's your interest here is deeper than that of the average person. The average person takes a newspaper in the morning, glances through it, maybe the front page headlines, the sports page, maybe some more things. You do it more deeply. As a civil service candidate, for example, you may have been reading the Hindu, the Indian Express, etc. That again, in one sense, is curricular. Curricular in the sense that you are advised to read these papers for preparing for civil services, general studies, current affairs, and so on. So claiming that your hobby is reading newspapers on the basis of reading Express and Hindu, I think would also not pass muster with the interview board. But if you claim to be reading half a dozen newspapers. Suppose you look at, let's think of some papers, international papers, the New York Times, the Guardian from London, Washington Post. You can read some of these papers in the electronic format now. You don't have to get paper versions. If you actually do this, then I think your claim that reading newspapers is a hobby has some justification. Not merely because you were reading the Hindu or the Indian Express as part of your preparation for civil services. And also keep in mind that if you claim that this is a hobby, they can ask you more in-depth questions. What is the editorial line of that newspaper? Controversies pertaining to newspapers. Some of the New York Times articles about India, for example, have been very controversial in our country. They are often critical of the NDA government, and NDA government ministers have reacted strongly. So you would be expected to have this type of knowledge. I'm not saying that you will be mentioning New York Times. I just give you that as an example. I hope it's clear to you that claiming these types of hobbies should be done carefully, keeping in mind the fact that the interview board is very experienced, fairly knowledgeable, and of course, also keeping in mind that it's much easier to ask questions. Even if I don't know anything about the New York Times or the Washington Post, I can ask you questions about them. Sometimes interview board members have also been known to use their mobile phones to Google, topics and ask questions on this. Some students at least have reported this. You can't go and tell the interview board member, if you are Googling for some question, let me Google for the answer. So that's where it becomes important to make sure that you write about these hobbies, interests in a focused, narrow manner, where you will be able to tackle questions that might be hurled at you by the interview board confidently. Of course, hobby does not mean that you know everything about it. So don't imagine that you have to be one of the greatest experts in the country on that particular topic. After all, it's a hobby. It's a part-time activity, your spare time. But in general, if you claim that something is a hobby, you should be putting in some time for it. You should have some passion about it, passionate about it. You should be able to express that before the interview board. Now, there are lots of interests and hobbies. My advice is make sure that whatever you're writing here is genuine. And it does not sound very trivial. It's not part of everyday life. Cooking can be a hobby. Again, as I've already explained, narrow it down to particular types of cooking, but not something like reheating the food that you have ordered in the microwave. That's hardly a hobby. That's everyday life activity. What is so special about it? You ordered some noodles. Noodles have become cold. You go and heat them up in the microwave. You wouldn't claim that as a hobby or an extracurricular activity or an interest, special interest. So make sure that these things are not trivial. They sound serious. They add to your, personality. Now, why is all this important? Well, this is a typical situation that some candidates at least face. I have no hobbies. This, I don't think, is a very good thing, because this would indicate that you have a very, very narrow perspective on life. So a hobby, let me summarize here, a hobby is an activity that you pursue in your leisure time, supposedly for pleasure and personal growth. You are enthusiastic and passionate about it, and you possess practical knowledge about it. That is when you should claim that as a hobby, as a special interest before the board, and you would be able to effectively answer the questions that the board may raise on this. Now, the importance of these hobbies is, and these interests is, there's generally thought that people should have interests beyond academics. Academic background is obviously very important. That's what you did in college. That's what you did during the civil services main examination. Your academic studies. A well-rounded personality should have interests beyond academics, beyond the typical college studies, beyond preparing for UPSC exams, and so on. Some interests in life. So personality assessment, these types of things are considered important. Before filling up these things, make sure of the points that we have mentioned today. If necessary, discuss it with some other people. But be careful of what you write. Every word that you write here can become the basis for a lot of questions. Some of those questions will be positive, that would add to your marks. But in other cases, it might land you in trouble. I'm not discouraging you. Remember, I'm encouraging you to mention hobbies, but do it carefully and making sure in the way that we have discussed that you are able or you are in a position to tackle the questions that might be thrown at you effectively. Right. Things like surfing internet, I would not advise as a hobby. See, sounds like a very superficial, or to some extent even a frivolous type of activity these days. We all use the internet for various purposes, for your studies, for your research, for whatever. But you're doing something more active, then it's a different matter. If you're blogging, for example, well, certainly that is a worthwhile hobby. Now, let's now move to a few other things of importance for the DAF. There are two other things on which we would like to comment. And there are many people, I suppose, who would be highly concerned about these. One is your service preferences. The civil services constitute or include a wide range of services. Many people do not know much about these services. When you start preparing for the civil services, often you just think in terms of the IAS, the Indian Administrative Service. Now, there are good reasons for thinking about the IAS, as we'll see in a moment. But there are many other services apart from the IAS. You are supposed to indicate your preference among these services in this form. Now, this is of long-term importance. The hobbies and the interests were of short-term importance. They matter as far as the interview is concerned. But this matters well beyond your selection. When you get selected, the allocation of services will be based on the preferences that you've expressed in your form. And there are people who have had a lifetime of regret because of what they filled up in the preferences. That should not happen to you. Don't make some mistake of filling up the form here regarding your preferences and end up with services where you are very unhappy. Now, before we get into the details of this, let me make a couple of points here also. See, all these services are worthwhile. None of these services that are included in part of the civil services should be considered useless. They are all useful for the country, for society, and so on, in some ways. All of them can constitute good careers. So it's not as if you land up in some service, you will then have this point that where have I come, what sort of activity have I got into. But the important point is that this is relative. When you are indicating your service preference, you are making a relative ranking. And if your rank is good enough, and you could have got a highly rated service, but you end up with something which is, not as good in some ways, that is what you will regret. That is why you have to be very careful in this. Very careful in filling up this. Now, some of the things here are obvious. Nothing much needs to be said about them. However, I think that those who have reached the stage of civil service interviews should have some understanding of the nature of these services, plus their own interests, and then decide on their preferences. So let me give you a very brief overview of the nature of these services. Keep in mind this is very brief, a few minutes. The core executive functions of government. You're going to be part of the executive when you join the civil services. The core executive functions are these: the Indian Administrative Service, General Administration, Police Service, maintenance of law and order, and representing India before the world, diplomacy, the Indian Foreign Service. Notice that the first two are All India services. Indian Foreign Service is not an All India service, that's a central service. You're serving the government of India. You're not going to be serving the states. But international relations, diplomacy is a key part of the executive functions. So this is also part of the core executive functions. Now, what about the other services? Supporting some executive functions. Support the various executive functions would include services like this: the Civil Account Service. The Civil Account Service, by the way, maintains the accounts of the central government, the government of India. It has nothing to do with accounts of the state governments. Now, any government, but particularly a democratic government, would need to interact with the citizens, with the people. So we have this Indian Information Service. The information role. So these support the core executive functions. Now, there are also the so-called Group B services, which are part again of the core executive functions. But keep in mind this is Group B. Group B means you're going to be subordinated. In fact, I'll put it this way. All of you would be aware of the state services. The services for which exams are conducted by the State Public Service Commission. The Karnataka's Commission, the Tamil Nadu Commission, the Maharashtra Commission, the West Bengal Commission. These are the services essentially for the main union territories. So you have these services like DANIX, DANIPS, and the Pondicherry or the Puducherry Civil Service. For the union territories. But these are equivalent of the services for which recruitment is carried out by the state commissions. In this case, the recruitment is being done by the UPSC through the civil services exam. So these are also core executive functions. Now what about the other services? Regulatory functions, the corporate law service is essentially implementation of the company law. At the moment, by the way, we are not ranking the services. We are just looking at the nature of the services. This is a regulatory function primarily. Revenue, raising revenue for the country. Now, in a sense, the IAS and the IPS are spending money. Somebody has to collect the money, raise revenue. So we have the customs and indirect taxes and the income tax, main sources of revenue for the government of India. Obviously, this is also a critical function. Then you have promotional and regulatory activities connected with the Indian Trade Service. We don't have time to get into all sorts of details here. Accountability. What are the key things that I hope you are now familiar with? Your preparation for general studies. Paper 2, polity governance, and paper 4, ethics, should be this idea of accountability. Accountability of government to the people. Accountability of the executive to parliament, and so on. This audit and account service is extremely important in that accountability framework. You'll have a bit more to say about this. There are certain services which are ultimately connected with providing some type of public service. These, by the way, could be done by the private sector also. For example, the postal service, postal services to the people. The P&T accounts and finance service, maintenance of the accounts for the postal and telegraph department. Then the railway protection service. The railways, by the way, of course, once upon a time, you had services like the Indian Railway Traffic Service as part of the civil services. Now, the reforms that have been carried out by the government recently have resulted in merger of a variety of railway services, a creation of a new service for railway management, for which recruitment will start from next year. So those services are no longer part of the civil service. However, this has remained. The Indian Railway Protection Force Service, the so-called RPF. Now, why have I put it here in provision of public services? Because railways provide an important public service, and this Railway Protection Force is protection of railway property, railway equipment, and so on. By the way, it's not really concerned with protecting the railway passengers. There are different service, there are different forces for that, the GRP. That's a state, part of the state police force. So this is focused on protection of railway property, railway equipment, and so on. Now, these are activities which at some stage might even be privatized. I'm not saying that that's going to happen in the near future, but it's possible that the postal service may be privatized, or the railways, some aspects at least, might be privatized in the future. It's not likely to happen in the near future. Now, how do we rank these services? Now, that's the important issue. In some ways, you have conventional ranking. Let me briefly explain. IAS is generally considered to be the apex service. Why? think of the reasons for this. Well, one is that as part of the IAS, you will be serving the government of India as well as the state governments. But there are other more important reasons. Look at the posts of secretaries in the government of India. Even today, this is the highest level of government for civil servants. The post of secretaries are dominated by IAS officers. Vast majority of the secretaries in the government of India are from the IAS. That doesn't mean that there are no secretaries from other services, but there are very few of them. If you leave aside the IFS for the moment, the other services together have about 5 or 6 secretary level posts, 5 or 6 secretaries. On the other hand, there might be something like 70 to 80 coming from an IAS background. So look at that discrepancy. 70 to 80 coming from IAS, maybe half a dozen coming from various other services, apart from the foreign service. Foreign service set aside for a moment. These services have been complaining to the government frequently. There are complaints made in 2017, 2020 to the Prime Minister that there is a lot of discrimination against the other services in terms of secretary level posts. Because the secretary level post, remember, is the apex of government, the government of India. Now you can understand why the IAS would be the top ranked. They dominate the higher echelons of administration. Some changes have taken place. At the joint secretary level, I think there is greater representation for these central services. Nevertheless, the highest levels are still dominated by the IAS. So IAS undoubtedly is still the premier service. Almost all candidates put IAS as their first preference. And I don't think this is unusual or surprising. I would say this is par for the course. So in terms of promotional opportunities, in terms of the range of responsibilities, etc., that you're likely to have, IAS is undoubtedly most important service. What about the foreign service? Let's comment a bit on this. 4 decades ago, if in the 1970s, up to the 70s, 60s, 70s, a lot of people used to rank IFS above the IAS. Then it changed. Now almost everybody ranks IAS above IFS. How justified is this? Well, let me remove some misconceptions first. IFS also has a significant number of secretary level posts. There are 5 secretaries in the Ministry of External Affairs. So there are 5 secretary level posts for the IFS. Many of India's ambassadors abroad also have the rank of secretary to the government of India. In fact, foreign ambassadors in India rank above secretaries in the warrant of precedence protocol. Another interesting thing, the foreign minister or the external affairs minister is also a former IFS officer. So in a sense, the minister is also from the IFS. Now, he is not in the IFS now, but he was an IFS officer earlier, Mr. Shiv Shankar. So IFS is certainly important. Globalization has in some ways increased the significance of IFS. India's relations with other countries are now much more important, with international organizations also. The role of IFS in that sense has expanded. But there is a reverse aspect that must be kept in mind, and that is that globalization has also meant that other officials can also, for example, travel abroad, represent India in different things. Let me give you an example. I met some senior officers from UP a couple of days ago. Senior meaning the rank of additional chief secretary, IAS officers obviously. They were all going abroad. One group was heading to South America to visit Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and so on. Another group was going to Western Europe, Southeast Asia, and so on. And what were they going for? This is UP's outreach to the world. UP is organizing investor summits. Senior IAS officials, and even some ministers, by the way, not just IAS officials, ministers also, are going abroad as part of delegations, conducting what you can call road shows to attract foreign investors to Uttar Pradesh. Now, this example is not to show that UP is a very successful state. You see, that is not my point. My point is that IAS officers are also playing a role in external outreach. All these additional chief secretaries are going as part of delegations to various countries. The foreign service officials in those countries, like say Brazil or Mexico, will be providing supportive services, supporting them, facilitating them, arranging meetings, and so on. So the IAS also has a lot of external outreach these days. That reduces the role for the foreign service. But all said and done, let me also make a last point. I think the foreign service is still an extremely important service. Foreign service still has significant attractions, charms, etc. And this idea that if you are in the IAS, you are in the public eye in India, and if you are in the IFS, people don't hear of you. I think this is overstretched. IAS officers are not always on the news. Only a few of them are in the news, in fact, even at the state level. Foreign service also has a lot of job satisfaction. Very significant role. Further, foreign service officials also serve inside India. There are lots of posts in the External Affairs Ministry in Delhi. There are even some posts at the state level. A regional passport officer, for example. Foreign service officer would be preferred for that. Of course, others can also be posted. So foreign service is still a very good service. This would partly depend on your personality, your interests, and so on. But I would in general think that unless you have some special reasons for preferring the police service, maybe IFS should be your second preference. Now keep in mind that this is something that is very specific to individuals. I'm just explaining some of the general features. Now, what about the police service? A lot of candidates put police service above IFS. Now, that is in fact in one way meaningless. That if you can't be allotted IPS, then you're not going to be allotted IFS either. This way it is possible. You might not be allotted IFS and yet get IPS, but not the other way around. That's most unlikely to happen. Why would you put police service above foreign service? Well, police service is an all India service. You're based in India. It's a uniformed service. Some people might be attracted by the charms of the uniform, the khaki. In some ways, it's a very powerful service. Many people in our country would fear the police service much more than the IAS. The power of the danda is more important. And certainly the IPS is very important in political terms. It is the police service, it's not the political service, but it's a highly politicized service. Why is it highly politicized? Politicians tend to use the IPS for their political purposes, to help their supporters, to harass their opponents, and so on. So police services tend to become highly politicized. Now, for some people, this might be charm of the IPS, but I would personally think of that as a disadvantage. If you have a classical civil servant approach, then you don't want to get into this sort of direct politics. That doesn't mean that I'm advising you against joining IPS. IPS is undoubtedly still a very important service. But don't take it for granted. That you must select IPS. Now, once that is through, let's turn to the revenue services. Income tax is generally nowadays ranked above customs and indirect taxes. There are various reasons for this. But one is the GST. The GST coming in, the responsibility here is now shared between the state services and the central services. That reduces the role of the central IRS, customs, and IT. IT here is indirect tax. This remains as it is. This is not affected by GST. Income tax is still levied by the Union of India, except of course for agricultural income. And these are also in some ways considered powerful services, powerful in affecting the finances of people. Important for businessmen, for corporates, and so on. If you are an income tax official posted in Mumbai, for example, well, you would have access to the leading studios, the film stars, and so on, because you will be assessing them. Another reason why this has become important in recent times is the Enforcement Directorate. A lot of income tax people go on deputation to the Enforcement Directorate. Just like a lot of IPS officers go on deputation to the CBI. So if the CBI and the Enforcement Directorate are important, then IPS and IRS IT will be important. It's clear about the ranking of these services. One of the services which I think is underrated is the audit and account service. In some ways, this is an excellent service. For those of you who may not be aware, let me just mention a couple of points. See, all the other services are under the government, ultimately. Ministries. This is not under the government. This is under the CAG, an independent constitutional authority. Promotions are much more timely in this audit and account service. Other services, you will often have controversies regarding promotions. IAAS, the promotions are very streamlined. IAAS, wide range of responsibilities. What does the audit and account service do, by the way? It maintains the accounts of the state governments. State government accounts are compiled and maintained by the audit and account service. Plus, they audit the accounts of both the central government and the state governments. This audit function is the accountability function. It's a powerful function. There is one disadvantage that I must mention. The head, the CAG, the Comptroller Auditor General of India, that's a constitutional post. That is not a service post. So an IAAS officer will not become Comptroller Auditor General of India. By tradition, that's an IAS post. But IAS after retirement, the IAS officer appointed as CAG will take retirement from the IAS because you're going to a constitutional post. But below that, the posts are held by IAAS. IAAS has excellent career prospects. And I think this is also better in some ways. If you don't like political pressure, if you like a balanced life, work-life balance, and so on, this would be probably better than many of these other services. That doesn't mean that you rank this above, say, IRS, IT, etc. Most people will still rank it below. But I'm explaining to you that there are certain very positive and advantageous aspects of this IAAS. That's why I said earlier, it's very underrated. It gives you a wide range of experience also at the state level, central level. And you're contributing to democratic accountability in the country. Now, these services, the ranking is fairly objective. But when it comes to the other services, I think it becomes much more subjective. So let me now briefly look at these. Comment on some of the advantages and disadvantages of these services before you. Now, why should one opt for DANICS and DANIPS? If you are interested in the core executive functions of government, administration part, and suppose you have not got into IAS, then DANICS could be a good choice. Why? Because you will be in the executive functions of government and you will be reasonably assured of promotion to the All India Service, the IAS. And then you will go into the Agamut cadre of the IAS, the Union Territory cadre. The same thing is true for DANIPS. After promotion, they go into IPS, Agamut cadre. And some people argue that you are based in Delhi. Well, that's not quite true. You could be posted to Andaman Nicobar Islands, etc. outside, at least for a few years. But Delhi would be probably the most important place for these services. So although these are Group B services, you do perform direct executive functions and you do get into Group A within a reasonable time frame. Of course, there are some political disadvantages. Think of this. The controversies in Delhi between the union government and the NCT government, that affects the officers of these services. But those are constitutional issues. Let the Supreme Court settle it. It's not your job or my job to look into that. I'm just pointing out that these services are good in some ways. Look at the other services. How would you rank them? Well, here I think again, as I said earlier, it's very, very subjective. A trade service. It has external role, trade negotiations, representing India in international bodies, WTO and so on. Plus internal role, export promotion. A lot of export promotion activities are going on throughout the country. So it's an important promotive role. And plus representing India abroad. Reasonable promotions. The civil account service. Maintenance of accounts of the government of India. Not the accounts of the state government. So you're focused again largely in Delhi. Largely in Delhi. Of course, there are Government of India offices outside also. But most of the postings are in Delhi. It's a very restricted type of service. Postal service, well, once upon a time the postal service was very important. Today the role of the postal department, I think, has shrunk a lot. Much more limited. And maybe at some time in the future, the government might actually give up this. I'm not saying that they're likely to do it, but they could in theory. So in that sense, one would not rank that as a very high now. Defense account service, I would rank it below the civil accounts because defense accounts is limited to just the defense ministry. In fact, sometimes it has been proposed that the defense account should be merged with the civil accounts. That's not happened, but it's more restricted. Of course, defense accounts, you get an advantage. You do get postings in different parts of the country. The controller of defense accounts, you will have postings in several parts of the country. A corporate law service, slightly misleading. This is basically implementation of the Companies Act, the Registrar of Companies. Unfortunately, many of those who have joined this are not very happy with the service conditions, with the promotions and so on. So ranking this high is not very sensible. I'm not saying it's not an important activity. Ease of doing business, promoting corporate activity, checking corporate fraud, all these are important tasks. But in relative ranking terms, this service is not going to be ranked very high. Many people would rank this below even these P&T accounts and so on. Now, what about some of the other services that are left now? Now, Pondix would be rated last for a logical reason. This is very, very confined Pondicherry. Unless you are from Pondicherry or maybe from Tamil Nadu, I don't see much reason to be enthusiastic about Pondix. In general, I don't think these defense-related services are also, very good in comparison to the others. Because here, the defense state service, for example, you would be ultimately under the defense officials, the armed forces, etc. Railway protection is also very, very narrow. So I don't think rating this would be also very high. Information service, we've already explained, it has a limited function. Now, keep in mind that these are Group A services, whereas these are Group B services. So you'll be starting out with a lower rank and a salary in these services. The advantage would be that you are in the core executive functions. Ultimately, you will reach the class 1 IAS, but with a lag. So, if the focus for you is to be in a class 1 service, then maybe you should rank the trade service, the postal service higher. Then DANIPS, put these down. Some of these other services can also be moved up. Although I would not rank corporate law service very high, nor would my advice be for IDES, etc. also. I'm not saying that leave these blank. Ultimately, it's a matter of your performance in a written exam and the interviews as to what service you are allotted. If you're lucky, you'll end up with the IAS, IPS, IFS. Not so lucky, you'll end up with one of these services. Don't leave them blank. Rank them, keeping in mind some of the points that I have made. I'm not giving you a strict ranking here because I don't think that is valid. Some people do this. This should be put, this position, this after this, and so on. I think to some extent this would depend on your aptitude, your interests, and so on. I pointed out the advantages and disadvantages, that these can be moved up and down. In some cases, the disadvantages are more, so keep them down. Others can be moved up and down, depending on your personal interest. Don't go by this idea that you have somebody who just tells you, fill it up like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Use your brains, use your interest and aptitude also in deciding this. Right. Now, the last of these points, the cadre preference. This is relevant if you are selected for the IAS and IPS. Central services, this is absolutely irrelevant. Now, this is important. In the last few years, the government of India has implemented this scheme, 2017 onwards. They have divided the country into 5 zones for the All India services, IAS and the IPS. Forest service is separate. Forest service is not part of this interview. And you are supposed to rank these zones. Notice there are 2 rankings to be done. Number 1, which zone do you rank first, second, third, fourth, fifth? And secondly, within the zone, how do you rank the various cadres? Let's imagine your first preference is zone 1. Then within zone 1, which of these services are you going to rank first? If you are Delhi centered, Agamut would be first. Remember, Agamut is Arunachal, Goa, Union Territories, Mizoram and Union Territories. Union territories would include Delhi. This is, by the way, the second biggest cadre now, because of a specific reason. Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh are also now part of this cadre, Agmut. So this is the second biggest cadre. The biggest cadre is obviously Uttar Pradesh, the biggest state in the country. So suppose you rank zone 1 first. Within zone 1, you might rank Agmut first. Jammu Kashmir is now cut out. This is wrong, by the way. We have just pasted it from the earlier version. Jammu Kashmir is now part of Agmut. So please make this correction. Jammu Kashmir is no longer separate in zone 1. It is now part of Agmut, both for the IAS and for the IPS, both cases is part of Agmut. So you would rank Agmut maybe first. Maybe after that you would rank Rajasthan, then Haryana and so on. Now here, keep in mind that the rankings here would depend on your personal background. Where are you from? Which region do you identify yourself with? Where would you like to serve? These are things which are directly connected with your personal background. So there is no standard answer here. Similarly, rankings of these cadres, there are 2-3 things to keep in mind. One is the size of the cadre. Uttar Pradesh is the biggest cadre for IAS and IPS both. So obviously UP would have large number of posts, but on the other hand, there would be large number of officers also. So size is important. Also important is something which you can't predict or you can't control, the political scenario. If some state is politically unstable, that affects postings and transfers also. Because these are largely done by the state governments. There might be disputes between the state government and the central government. Then other problems will arise. But these are things which you can't predict. How do we know what will happen after 2024 elections? How do we know which party would be ruling in which state? Or for that matter, at the central level? Sorry. So keep the fact that there are a lot of uncertainties in mind in deciding on this. If you are from, say, UP, sorry. You are from UP, you would rank Zone 2 as your first rank. And within Zone 2, UP as first, if you want to opt for your home state. Now, one thing that you must understand is, when you rank, say, UP, Uttar Pradesh first, Bihar second, let's imagine you put it this way, Zone 2. Suppose you don't get UP, you don't get your home state. Then they don't consider this, they consider your next preference in the zone. Suppose you have given this zone, Zone 1, as your next preference. So then your first preference in Zone 1 is what will come into play. You would be considered for that. If you don't get that, then they will come to, say, Zone 3, if this is your third preference. Your first preference here, and so on. So it goes zone-wise. And then within the zone is the secondary factor. The primary is zones. First, which is your first preference, which is your second, which is your third preference in the zone. You want your home state? Always rank that first. If you say, yes, I'm opting for my home state, then you would have to rank that zone. If you are from UP, you will rank this first. If you are from, say, West Bengal, you will rank zone 4 first, and so on. This is something for you to decide. Do not go by this type of advice. Let me give you some examples. A lot of people would advise you, this is a very bad zone. Assam, Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura, Nagaland. Why? Northeast. West Bengal, controversial state in some ways. If you are not from that area, you might have some concerns, vary. But there are various things to keep in mind. Many of these states are classified as hardship states. Jammu Kashmir is also now, by the way, in Agmut, Jammu Kashmir is also classified as a hardship state. What does that mean? You get particular benefits and advantages. If you are in Jammu Kashmir, for example, Agmut cadre, you will be allowed to retain your accommodation in Delhi also. This is not applicable if you are in, say, Tamil Nadu cadre or Bihar cadre or Telangana cadre. Hardship states are given special benefits. The government wants better officers to go to these states also. And transportation is now very easy. Flying from Guwahati to Delhi is not difficult today. Couple of hours you will be in Delhi, or anywhere else in the country for that matter. So the traditional ideas of certain zones being very bad, I don't think that should be of great relevance to you. Also keep in mind that if you are from these small states, cadres, you will be getting higher positions much faster. Of course, in a small state. Central deputation chances are also higher in these states. Easier to get central deputations. But once again, the same point applies. There is no fixed answer as to which should be ranked where. That depends on where you are from. What is your demographic background? If you are from the Hindi-speaking belt, for example, let's imagine you are from UP or Bihar, then obviously you will be inclined to rank zone 2 first. After zone 2, you can choose zone 1 and zone 3. You're going by that logic. Suppose you're from the south, zone 5. But then what about after zone 5? Well, many of the people from zone 5 will choose zone 3 as the second preference. They are more comfortable with Maharashtra and Gujarat as compared to, say, UP and Bihar. But this is also, a conventional idea. Suppose you are a person from Andhra who has studied in IIT Kanpur, and we find examples like this every year in the mock interviews, who studied in IIT Kanpur. I think you should be equally comfortable with Uttar Pradesh. Maybe not with Bihar, but Bihar is similar. It doesn't make much of a difference now. And once you have spent significant time in some state, you tend to adopt the cultural values, etc. of that state. And people often settle down in the state. I've even seen people, after retirement, let's say a person from Andhra, based in Bihar, Jharkhand, IPS or IAS officer, they have settled down after retirement in these states and sometimes have even sought to play a political role in that state. So India has changed. The traditional ideas of these cadre selection have less and less validity. Nevertheless, let me repeat, ultimately your choice would be based on whether you want to be in your home region. So you start with that, whatever your home region is. And maybe opt for the adjacent regions after that, and then move further. But do not go by this logic that this is extremely bad. That, I think, is now an outdated idea. Things have changed a lot in the Northeast, and they will change further. And plus the special benefits that are being given for officers in Jammu Kashmir and several of the northeastern states are also quite beneficial. So that must also be kept in mind. One small strategic point. Suppose despite all my advice, let's imagine you are from zone 3. Let's imagine you are from zone 3. And maybe you opt for Maharashtra as your first preference in zone 3. And suppose you're very reluctant to go to Northeast. You don't want to go to this area, you don't want to go to this area, and so on. No, maybe you want to go to zone 5, but you don't want to go to zone 4. What strategy can you adopt? Give a strategic advice here. You put zone 3 first, Maharashtra as your first preference here. Suppose you are allotted Maharashtra. Very good, that you get your home state. That's your home state. Suppose you don't get this, and you have given zone 5 as your second preference. Let's imagine you have given zone 5 as your second preference, zone 2 as your third preference. And suppose your main purpose is, I don't want to go to this. What strategy can you adopt? Well, one of the strategies that might work is this. Let's take zone 2. In zone 2, UP would be the most popular. Jharkhand and Odisha will be much less popular. Suppose you don't want to go to zone 4 and your ranking, zone 2 is above zone 4. I hope you're following my point. You have ranked zone 2 above zone 4. Now, if in zone 2 you have chosen UP and UP is extremely popular, you might not get allotted UP. Then after that zone 4, you might get one of these states which you don't want. So what should you do? You can take this strategy. Take a state which is less popular in this zone. Suppose you opt for Bihar or for Jharkhand or for Odisha. The chances of that allocation will be greater than the allocation of UP, which would be much more popular. So you might get allotted one of these states, and then you will not be considered for this because you already got your allocation. This is just a minor point. I would not like to overemphasize this. I hope you've understood what I'm trying to say again. All these things have complications. So this is like a strategic choice. Choose a less popular state in a zone that you would like compared to the zone that you don't want. But less popular means you're more likely to get that, even with a lower rank. Also keep in mind that IAS and IPS, you can have different zone preferences. In general, there is no reason to have different zone preferences. Nowadays, those ideas about certain states being Naxal affected and extremist affected, and being an IPS officer in those states being dangerous, I don't think these things have much validity. So you don't need to worry unduly about these points. Right? Fill up your zone preferences in a systematic manner. All right, this is the typical zone preferences. Now, I think we have explained most of the points that are relevant. In fact, every point that is relevant in DAF 2. Fill this up carefully. We are not trying to dictate your preferences or your zone choices. We are trying to explain what should be the logic behind it. You fill it up, prepare for the interviews next month, do well. We wish you best of luck. Physics Wala is bringing you other sessions for the interviews, as well as mock interview sessions are being organized. Join them, benefit from them. That's all from me for today. Thank you. Goodbye.